She told me, "You're too boring for me," at our engagement party. She didn't know I'd already found her second phone. She said it with a champagne glass in her hand, in front of 40 of our closest friends and family. At the party celebrating our engagement, she smiled when she said it, like it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. What she didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, I found a phone in the lining of her gym bag that wasn't supposed to exist, and by the time she opened her mouth that night, I already knew exactly whose name was saved under Yoga Studio in her contacts. My name is Nathan Reyes. I'm 34 years old. I work in cybersecurity, specifically incident response, the kind of job where companies call me after something's already gone wrong and they need someone to figure out exactly how, when, and by whom. I've spent 11 years learning how to read digital footprints the way other people read facial expressions. I didn't expect that skill to end up pointed at my own home. But that's the thing about the work I do, it doesn't stay in the office. It becomes how you see the world. I want to tell this story properly, from the beginning, because the ending only makes sense if you understand how slowly, how quietly, the middle came apart. Camille Ashworth and I met 6 years ago at a mutual friend's rooftop party in Denver. She was 31 then, no, wait, she was 25 then, 31 now, a marketing director for a growing outdoor apparel brand. Sharp-tongued, quick-witted, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately know who mattered and why. I was quieter, still am. I like watching more than talking, which she used to tease me about affectionately. "You're the smartest quiet person I've ever met," she told me once. Early on, in a way that felt like a compliment at the time. We dated for 4 years before I proposed. I'd planned it for months, a hike up to a ridge outside Boulder where we'd had our first real date. A small box I'd kept hidden in my gym locker at work because I didn't trust myself not to fidget with it at home. She said yes. She cried. I remember thinking, standing on that ridge with the wind picking up and her face buried in my jacket, that I had built something solid, something that would hold. For the first year of the engagement, it did hold, mostly. We picked a venue, a restored barn outside Lyons with exposed beams and a view of the foothills that made Camille cry. The first time we walked through it, we argued about guest lists the way every couple argues about guest lists. Mostly over how many of her coworkers needed to be there versus how many of my cousins could reasonably be left off. Without starting a family incident, we had inside jokes about the wedding planner's obsession with centerpieces, a woman named Trish who used the word elevated, so often it became a household joke between us, one of us saying it dryly whenever the other suggested anything even slightly ambitious, like a new brand of coffee or a different route to the grocery store. It felt, on the surface, like the natural next chapter of something good. I want to include a few details from that first year because I think they matter to what comes later, not as evidence of anything, just as a record of what we actually had before it started slipping. We used to cook together on Sunday nights, working through a cookbook her aunt had given us as an early engagement gift. Going through it alphabetically for no reason except that it gave us something to organize around. We had a running list, taped inside a kitchen cabinet, of restaurants we wanted to try before the wedding, 11 of them, by my count, out of which we made it to 4. We used to take her dog, a stubborn terrier mix named Biscuit who'd come with her from a relationship before mine, on long Saturday morning walks through a park near our apartment, arguing amiably about whether Biscuit understood English or just tone of voice. I bring this up not out of nostalgia for its own sake, but because I think it's important to say clearly, this wasn't a relationship that started broken, or one I can look back on and say I should have seen coming from day one. It was, for a real stretch of time, a good and ordinary life. That matters to what made the shift, when it came, so difficult to name. You don't expect erosion in a house you built carefully. You expect it in houses you already suspected were unstable. Then, somewhere around 14 months before the party where she said those words to me, things began to shift. I want to be honest about how slowly it happened, because that's the part people don't believe when you tell this story. How long you can live inside a slow erosion without naming it. The first thing I noticed was her schedule. Camille had always gone to a 6 a.m. spin class on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Around the spring of that year, the spin class became a new yoga studio downtown. And the schedule expanded, Tuesday, Thursday, and now Saturday mornings too. When I asked how the new studio was, she'd give me a one-line answer and change the subject. "It's good, really intense instructor, nothing more." I told myself it was just Camille being Camille. Private about her fitness routine the way some people are private about their finances. Then there was the phone. She'd always kept it face up on the kitchen counter, no passcode. Because we'd never had anything to hide from each other. Around that same spring, it started living face down. Then it started living in her bag. Then it started needing a passcode. When I asked about it, almost in passing, she said, "Work stuff." HR's been weird about phone security since the merger. Her company hadn't had a merger. I noticed the perfume next, a specific, sharp citrus and leather scent that didn't match anything in the drawer of bottles she kept on her dresser. I noticed the new gym clothes, sleeker, more expensive than anything she'd worn before. The kind you buy when you want someone specific to notice you in them. I noticed that she started keeping a second gym bag in the trunk of her car instead of the hall closet. "So I don't forget it on busy mornings," she said. I want to be clear that none of these things, on their own, meant anything. People change routines. People buy new gym clothes. It's the accumulation that eventually stops being coincidence and starts being a pattern. And once you notice the pattern, you cannot unnotice it. That's the part of my job that followed me home without asking permission. once you're trained to see anomalies. You can't switch the training off just because it's inconvenient to see one in your own kitchen. There was a night, around that same time, when a friend of mine, Owen, someone I'd known since college, blunt in the specific way old friends are allowed to be blunt, said something over drinks that I brushed off at the time and thought about constantly afterward. We were at a bar downtown, the two of us, and I'd mentioned, casually, that Camille had picked up a new yoga habit and seemed happier for it. Owen didn't say much in response, just turned his glass slowly on the bar top. And then said, "You know that's usually what people say right before they tell you the other thing, right? She seems happier. It's never actually about the yoga." I laughed it off. I told him he was being cynical, that not every new hobby is a cover story. That some people actually do just start going to yoga. He didn't push it. He just said, "Sure. I hope I'm wrong," and changed the subject to something about his own job. I didn't think about that conversation again for weeks. Then, once the pattern started to reveal itself in earnest, I thought about almost nothing else. I've wondered since whether Owen had noticed something specific, some detail at a party or a group dinner that I'd missed, or whether he was simply speaking from the general, weary experience of having watched enough friends go through the same thing. I never asked him directly. Some questions you don't want answered even when you already suspect the answer. Around the same period, Camille also began spending more time on her phone with the screen brightness turned unusually low, a habit I noticed one evening when she was texting under the dinner table. Thinking I hadn't seen the glow of the screen barely visible against her lap. When I asked, lightly, who she was talking to, she said, "Just a work thread." Everyone stressed about the quarterly numbers. I let it go. I let almost everything go, for months, because the alternative, treating every small oddity as a potential crisis, felt like a worse way to live than simply hoping the erosion I sensed wasn't real. The night everything cracked open for me, not confirmed yet, but cracked, was a Wednesday in late winter. Camille had gone to bed early, said she had an early yoga session the next morning. I was doing laundry, which in our house meant going through pockets before the wash. An old habit from years of finding receipts and gum wrappers in my own jeans. Her gym bag was on the laundry room floor, unzipped from where she'd tossed it that afternoon. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to say that clearly. I was looking for a stray sock. What I found instead, tucked into the lining pocket of the bag, a pocket I hadn't known existed until that night, was a phone. Not her phone. A different one, a cheap prepaid model, powered off, small enough to disappear into a palm. I stood in that laundry room for a long time before I did anything. Not confronting her, not immediately turning it on, just standing there with the weight of it in my hand. Feeling something in my chest go very still. Not anger yet, just a cold, clarifying quiet, the same quiet I feel at 2 a.m. when a client calls me because their network's been breached and the first thing I need to do is stop feeling anything and start documenting everything. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, zipped the bag the way it had been zipped, and went to bed beside a woman I no longer fully recognized. I didn't confront her, not that week, not that month. I want to explain why, because I know how that sounds, like weakness. Or like I was building some elaborate trap for its own sake. It's neither. In my line of work, the single most important lesson you learn is this: if you confront the source of a breach before you understand its full scope, you don't get the truth. You get a hastily deleted log, a rebuilt cover story, a threat actor who now knows you're watching and adjusts accordingly. You lose the ability to see the whole picture. I wasn't going to make that mistake in my own marriage before it even started. So I watched, quietly, methodically, the way I'd been trained to. I didn't touch the second phone again, not yet. I started paying attention instead to the patterns around it. Which mornings she left earlier than usual. Which evenings she came home with her hair slightly damp, claiming a shower at the gym. The way she started angling her real phone away from me at dinner. A habit that had crept in so gradually I'd almost stopped registering it as new. 3 weeks after I found the phone, I called my sister, Elena. Elena's 31, and her nurse, the kind of person who's seen enough human behavior at 3 a.m. to have very little patience for slow-building lies. I told her everything, the phone, the yoga studio, the perfume, the pattern. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About 3 weeks, and you haven't said anything." "Not yet." There was a pause, the kind Elena uses right before she says something she knows I don't want to hear but need to. "Nathan," she said, "you already know. You're just waiting for proof so you don't have to be the one who ends it on a feeling." She wasn't wrong. That's exactly what I was doing. What I hadn't told Elena yet, what I hadn't told anyone, was that 4 days before that phone call, I'd finally turned the second phone on. Just once, just long enough to see what was on the lock screen before powering it back off and returning it to the bag. No passcode prompt. It went straight to a messaging app, the kind built around disappearing messages. I didn't open a single conversation. I didn't need to. I just needed to know it existed, and that it wasn't something I could explain away as work stress or gym paranoia. I want to talk for a moment about what those weeks felt like. Because I think that's the part people skip over when they tell these stories, the living with it part, before the confrontation, before the reveal. It's not dramatic. It's quiet and exhausting in a way that's hard to describe. You go to work, you answer emails, you sit in client meetings talking about firewall configurations while some part of your mind is running a background process, cross-referencing a Tuesday morning against a receipt against a cent you can't place. You come home and make dinner with someone you love, or loved, or are trying to figure out if you still love, and you ask about her day. And she tells you about a meeting that may or may not have happened. And you nod, and you clear the plates, and you go to bed next to her. And none of it feels real, and all of it feels unbearably real at the same time. I didn't fall apart during those weeks. I want to be honest about that too, because I think there's an expectation that a story like this should include some scene of me breaking down on a bathroom floor. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and, in some ways, worse, a kind of methodical grief that ran alongside methodical investigation, the two feelings occupying the same space without canceling each other out. Elena came over for dinner one Sunday during this stretch, before I told her anything. And I remember her studying me across the table with the specific clinical attentiveness she uses on patients who insist they're fine when their vitals say otherwise. You're quieter than usual, she said. Even for you. Work's been a lot, I told her, which wasn't a lie exactly, just an incomplete one. She didn't push that night, though I found out later she'd mentioned it to our mother. In passing, that something about my energy had felt off. It would be another 3 weeks before I told her the actual reason. And when I finally did, sitting on her couch with the second phone's existence spoken out loud for the first time, she didn't look surprised so much as she looked like something she'd already half suspected had just been confirmed. The turning point, the moment I stopped simply watching and started actively building a case, if I can use that word, came on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after I found the phone. Camille left for her 6 a.m. yoga session, as usual. I had a client call at 7:30 that got pushed to the following day, which meant I had an unexpected, unplanned window of time. I want to be clear that I did not go looking for her that morning with any plan. I simply had time, and an idea occurred to me, and once it occurred to me I couldn't set it down. I drove past the yoga studio she'd named, an actual studio, a real business, not a fabrication, at 6:20 a.m. Her car wasn't in the lot. I sat there for 11 minutes, engine off, feeling something in my stomach that I can only describe as the physical sensation of a hypothesis being confirmed. Then I drove to a coffee shop 2 blocks away and sat with a cup I didn't drink. And I let myself feel it, really feel it, for the first time since the laundry room. Not for long, 10 minutes, maybe 15. Then I did what I always do when a feeling threatens to become bigger than the facts can support. I went back to the facts. That weekend, while Camille was at brunch with a friend, I did something I'm not entirely proud of but don't regret. I have professional-grade network monitoring software, the same kind I use for client engagements, and our home network, like most modern homes, runs almost everything through it: laptops, phones, smart devices. I'd set it up myself 2 years earlier for security reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. I ran a passive traffic analysis, nothing invasive, just a log of which devices connected to which networks and when. It confirmed that Camille's actual phone, not the second one, had been connecting to a specific hotel's guest Wi-Fi network on 4 separate Tuesday and Thursday mornings over the preceding 2 months. A hotel 12 minutes from her office. Not 12 minutes from any yoga studio. I found the credit card statement 2 days later, not hidden. Just filed in a drawer of unopened mail she hadn't gotten around to sorting and cross-referenced it against the Wi-Fi timestamps. 3 charges at that same hotel, small amounts, likely just parking or a coffee. But enough to place her there, definitively, on mornings she'd told me she was in a yoga class. I called a private investigator a colleague had recommended years earlier for a corporate case, a retired detective named Marcus Webb who did discreet personal work on the side. I didn't tell him everything. I gave him a name, a pattern of days, a location. I asked him to confirm what I already suspected, because I needed something beyond my own network logs and my own conclusions. Something that would hold up if this ever needed to hold up to more than just my own judgment. It took Marcus 9 days. What he brought back confirmed a 5-month relationship between Camille and a man named Derek Voss, 33 years old. A personal trainer at a boutique fitness studio 2 floors up from that same yoga studio she'd named as her cover story. Marcus had photographs, time-stamped, dated, unambiguous. Camille and Derek entering the hotel together on 3 occasions. Camille and Derek at a restaurant across town on a night she told me she was working late on a campaign launch. I sat with those photographs for 2 full days before I did anything else. Not confronting her, not yet. I want to explain, one more time, why the delay mattered to me. Because I think it's the part of this story that separates a reaction from a response. A reaction is immediate and it's often shaped entirely by the person who caused the hurt. You confront them in the moment, on their terms, in the emotional state they put you in. And they get to manage the narrative from the very first sentence. A response happens on your own timeline, with your own information. When you're the one who understands the full shape of what happened before anyone else gets to spin it. So I waited, not passively. I used those days to make decisions. I met with a family law attorney, even though we weren't yet married. Because I needed to understand what mattered legally. The engagement ring, a gift. Generally not something you're obligated to return if the relationship ends due to infidelity. Depending on the state, though Colorado has its own nuances. The joint deposit we'd already put down on our wedding venue, $14,000, split between us but paid predominantly from an account I'd funded, and the apartment lease we'd signed 8 months earlier when we decided to move in together ahead of the wedding. The attorney, a calm, precise woman named Renata Cole, listened to the whole thing without interrupting. The way people do when they've heard 100 versions of this story and have stopped being surprised by any of them. You're not married, she said, so this isn't a divorce case. But if there are jointly held assets, that deposit, the lease, infidelity itself isn't typically what determines Financial outcomes. What matters is who paid what, and whether there was any deception involved in how shared money was spent or represented. There was, I said, and told her about the $14,000 deposit. How 3 weeks after finding the second phone, I noticed a $2,200 charge on our joint wedding savings account that Camille had explained as an emergency dress alteration. I hadn't questioned it at the time. Now, cross-referencing dates, that charge landed the same week as one of the hotel visits Marcus had documented. That's worth looking into, Renata said. If shared funds were used to facilitate the affair, that's relevant, not for punishment. But for restitution, I called Carla. No, I want to be careful with names here. This detail matters. I called a forensic accountant a former client had recommended. A meticulous woman named Priya Baxter, and asked her to trace the wedding savings account in full. It took her 5 days. She found that over 4 months, roughly $6,800 of the $14,000 we both contributed to had gone toward things unrelated to any wedding vendor. Hotel charges disguised as vendor deposits. A spa day logged as bridal preparation research. A dinner logged as a venue tasting at a restaurant that, according to public records, had never hosted a single wedding tasting event in its history. I want to pause here and say something honestly. Finding the money was, in a strange way, harder to sit with than finding the affair itself. The affair was a betrayal of me. The money was a betrayal of something we'd built together, deliberately. Dollar by dollar, for a future that, I now understood, she'd never actually intended to walk into with me. Priya walked me through the spreadsheet line by line over a video call. Her voice level and professional in a way I was grateful for. Because I don't think I could have absorbed the details if they'd been delivered with any more emotion than her own. This one, she said, highlighting a cell, logged as a floral consultation. $410, doesn't match any invoice from the florist you mentioned. This one, $620, logged as bridal party gift. Was actually a charge at a men's clothing store 2 blocks from the hotel. She paused. I don't say this to make it worse. I say it because you should know exactly what you're looking at before you decide what to do with it. I asked her whether, in her experience, this kind of pattern was common. She said, carefully, that she'd seen versions of it more times than she'd like to admit, money laundered. In a sense, not through anything as sophisticated as an offshore account, but through the mundane infrastructure of an engagement itself, disguised inside the very category of spending that was supposed to represent a shared future. People don't realize, she said, how easy it is to hide something inside a budget everyone assumes is sacred. Nobody double-checks a wedding expense the way they double-check a business one. That detail stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this story. The idea that the wedding itself, the thing meant to formalize a life together, had been quietly repurposed as camouflage. I spent the 3 days between receiving Priya's full report and the engagement party in a strange, suspended state I don't fully know how to describe. I went to work. I ran a client engagement that week, a mid-sized logistics company that had suffered a data breach through an employees' compromised credentials, and I remember sitting in their conference room walking their leadership team through an incident timeline, the exact same skill set, applied to a completely different kind of breach that I was quietly applying to my own life outside those walls. There's a strange comfort in competence, even competence pointed at something painful. It gave me somewhere to put my hands while the rest of me waited. I didn't decide, during those 3 days, exactly how or when I'd say anything. I want to be honest that the moment at the party wasn't fully planned in advance. I hadn't scripted the words I eventually said. What I had decided, firmly, was that I would not let another month pass carrying this alone while Camille continued to plan a wedding she had no real intention of honoring. I decided the truth was coming out soon, on my terms, with my documentation intact. I just didn't yet know it would happen in her parents' backyard. Under string lights, 15 seconds after she called me boring in front of her coworkers. The engagement party was already scheduled for that Saturday, planned 2 months earlier. Before any of this, a celebration for both families to formally meet before the wedding. I want to be honest, I considered canceling it. I decided not to, for one specific reason. I wanted to see, one more time, whether Camille would tell me the truth on her own, without my having to force it out of her. I gave her that chance, quietly, all evening, in small ways, asking about her week. Asking about the yoga studio, asking, at one point, directly, is there anything you want to talk to me about, before Saturday? She said no. She said everything was fine. She smiled while she said it. That's the part that still sits with me, more than the affair itself. Not that she lied about Derek. That she looked me in the eye, 3 days before the party, and chose, deliberately, calmly, to keep lying when I'd all but handed her the door to stop. The party was at her parents' house, string lights across the backyard. A rented arch decorated with white flowers, 40 or so people from both families holding champagne glasses in the early evening light. I want to describe this scene carefully, because I remember every detail of it with unusual precision, the way you remember the exact temperature of a room where something important happened to you. It had rained lightly that morning, so the grass still held a faint dampness that caught the last of the sun as it dropped behind the hedge line at the back of the property. Camille's mother, Diane, had spent 2 days arranging the backyard herself, mason jars with candles down the center of each folding table, a playlist of songs that leaned heavily on early 2000s R&B because she knew it was what Camille and I had danced to at our first anniversary dinner. I remember noticing the effort in all of it, the care her family had put into celebrating something that, on my end at least, I already knew was hollowed out at the center. That contrast, genuine warmth surrounding a lie, is part of what made the evening feel so strange even before anything happened. Camille had arrived looking, by all outward appearances, happy. Genuinely so, in a way that unsettled me more than if she'd seemed nervous or distracted. She laughed easily with her cousins. She hugged my mother longer than usual. At one point, early in the evening, she caught my eye across the yard and mouthed, "I love you," the way she used to before any of this started. And for one disorienting second I let myself believe, entirely against the evidence sitting in a folder on my laptop at home, that maybe I'd misread everything, that maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered. That's the particular cruelty of a well-hidden betrayal. It leaves just enough room for hope to survive right up until the moment it's finally extinguished for good. Camille's mother gave a toast first, warm and a little tearful, the kind mothers give. My father gave one after, shorter, characteristically dry, the kind of toast that gets a bigger laugh than it probably deserves. Then there was a lull, the natural pause after the formal toasts. When people start refilling glasses and drifting into smaller conversations. It was during that lull that Camille, standing next to me with her arm loosely through mine, turned to a small cluster of her coworkers who'd wandered over. And someone, I don't even remember who, one of her friends from the marketing department, made an offhand joke about how steady and reliable I was, meant as a compliment, the kind people give quiet men at parties. Camille laughed, not unkindly, at first, but there was an edge under it that I recognized immediately. Because I'd been listening for edges like that for 2 months. "He is reliable," she said, swirling her glass. "Sometimes I think he's a little too reliable. A little too." She paused, smiling at her friends like she was building toward a punchline. Boring for me, honestly. A few people laughed, the uncomfortable kind of laugh people give when they're not sure if something's a joke or a confession. Her friend from marketing looked at me, then looked away. I didn't react the way she expected. I know this because I watched her face while I didn't react, watched her wait for half a second for the hurt to show up on my face so she could walk it back with an, "I'm just kidding, babe," the way she'd done with smaller jabs before. It didn't show up, not because I didn't feel it, I did, sharply, in that specific place under the ribs where humiliation lands when it's delivered in public, but because I'd had 2 months to prepare for a version of this moment. Even if I hadn't known it would look exactly like this. I smiled instead, a real smile, small, and I said, evenly, loud enough for the small cluster around us to hear, "That's all right. Reliable's been carrying a lot of weight lately, including the $14,000 in our wedding account, 6,000 of which went to a hotel near your office and a personal trainer named Derek." I want to describe the silence that followed because I've never experienced anything quite like it before or since. It wasn't a gasp, it was a full stop, the sound of 40 conversations simultaneously deciding to end. Camille's face went through several colors in about 3 seconds, the flush of the champagne. A tightening pale, then a deep, specific red that has nothing to do with wine. "Nathan," she started. "I'm not going to make a scene," I said, still calm, still quiet enough that this felt like a conversation between two people rather than a performance, even though I knew, by then, that everyone within 15 feet was listening. "I just didn't want you to be the only one who got to decide when the truth came out tonight." Her mother's hand had gone to her mouth. Her father was staring at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, somewhere between confusion and, I think, a dawning understanding of his own, based on some detail I wasn't privy to. Elena, my sister, standing near the drink table, had gone very still, watching. Camille set her glass down on a nearby table, her hand visibly unsteady. "Can we not do this here?" she said, her voice dropping into something tight and urgent. "You did it here first," I said. "You told 40 people I'm too boring for you 15 seconds ago." I'm just finishing the thought. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything, didn't storm off dramatically, didn't cry. Though I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to do all three. What I did instead was set my own glass down, thank her parents for hosting, and say, clearly, to the small crowd still frozen around us, "I think the engagement's off. I'm sorry for the timing, this wasn't the plan for tonight." Then I walked to my car, in the cool evening air, and drove to my sister's apartment because I'd already told Elena 3 days earlier that I might need somewhere to stay that weekend. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat on Elena's couch with a glass of water I didn't drink, replaying the look on Camille's face, not the anger, which I'd expected, but the specific, brief flash of something that looked almost like relief. Like some part of her had been exhausted by the performance and was almost grateful, for half a second, that it was over. My mother called me the morning after the party, before I'd even had coffee. Her voice careful in the way it gets when she's trying not to sound as upset as she actually is. "Your father and I didn't know what to do with ourselves last night," she said. "We didn't want to make it worse by saying anything in the moment." She asked if I was all right. Asked whether I needed her to come stay with me for a few days. Offered, in the specific practical way she offers things, to help me figure out what to do about the vendors we'd already booked, the photographer, the caterer, the string quartet Camille had insisted on for the ceremony itself. I told her I'd handle the vendors, and mostly, I did, though it took the better part of 2 weeks. The photographer, a woman named Ingrid who'd shot 3 of my cousin's weddings, was gracious about it, refunding half our deposit without my even asking. Saying only, "These things happen more than people think. I'm sorry it's you this time." The caterer was less generous, a non-refundable deposit clause I'd half forgotten signing, which Renata reviewed and confirmed was, unfortunately, ironclad. The string quartet's deposit, smaller, was refunded in full after a single polite email. Camille's parents, for their part, reached out to the venue themselves within 2 days of the party. Mortified, according to what Elena heard secondhand through a mutual family friend, at having hosted the evening in their own backyard without any warning of what was coming. Diane called me once, about a week later, her voice thick in a way that told me she'd been crying before she dialed. "I don't know what to say to you, Nathan," she said. "I raised her better than this. I don't know what happened." I told her, honestly, that I didn't think this was something she needed to apologize for on Camille's behalf, and that I hoped, whatever came next in her family, it came with more honesty than the year I just lived through. She thanked me, quietly, and we didn't speak again after that. Though I still think about the specific grief in her voice sometimes, the grief of a parent watching their child's choices land, belatedly, on someone else's life. The following morning, I called Renata Cole and told her what had happened. She wasn't surprised. She told me, calmly, that public confrontations at events like that were more common than people think, precisely because they force a resolution neither party would otherwise choose to initiate. "What do you want to pursue?" she asked. "Formally, I mean," I told her. "The return of the $6,800 in misused wedding funds. Documented and traceable through Priya's forensic report." The venue deposit, Camille's parents, understandably mortified by the scene at their own home, had already reached out to the venue the next day to cancel the booking. We split the forfeited portion of the deposit according to what each of us had actually contributed, which Priya's records made simple to calculate. The ring, I chose not to pursue, though Colorado law would have allowed it. Some things aren't worth the additional conflict, and I'd rather it become the symbol of something Camille has to carry than something I have to fight over. The apartment lease was the more complicated piece. We'd co-signed 8 months earlier, and Camille had already been the one to move out, to her sister's place, within 4 days of the party, before I'd even asked her to. I remember coming home from Alina's on the 5th day to find half the apartment already emptied, her side of the closet bare, the bathroom counter stripped down to just my own things. A note on the kitchen counter that said only, "I'll have my parents handle the venue call." I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean much right now. I stood in that half-empty apartment for a long time, the specific quiet of a shared space with half its contents suddenly missing. And I remember thinking that even in the act of leaving, she'd managed to make the process feel less like a conversation, and more like something that had simply been decided, elsewhere, without me. Renata helped negotiate an early lease termination with the landlord, splitting the penalty according to the same proportional contribution model Priya had already documented for the wedding fund. The landlord, to his credit, was reasonable about it once Renata explained the circumstances in the careful, neutral language attorneys use for exactly this kind of situation. No mention of affairs or misused funds. Just a change in relationship status necessitating an amended lease arrangement. It wasn't dramatic. It was paperwork, mostly the unglamorous aftermath of something that had felt, in the moment, cinematic. I spent one final weekend in that apartment alone, boxing up the remaining shared items, a coffee maker we'd bought together our first month living together, a set of mismatched mugs from a farmer's market we used to visit, the alphabetical cookbook, which I left on the counter for her to collect rather than packing it myself. There's a particular kind of grief in disassembling a home piece by piece that I don't think gets talked about enough in stories like this one. It's not the dramatic grief of the confrontation itself, but the slower, more granular grief of realizing how many small, ordinary objects had quietly absorbed meaning over 6 years, and how strange it is to hold each one and decide, alone, what happens to it next. I want to talk about Derek Voss for a moment, because I think what happened to him matters to the shape of this story. Even though it wasn't really about him, Marcus Webb's background work had turned up more about Derek than I initially asked for. Mostly because Marcus, in his own words, doesn't like leaving a thread half pulled. Derek had worked at 3 different studios across the Denver metro area over the previous 6 years. And at 2 of them, according to former colleagues Marcus spoke with informally, he'd developed a reputation, nothing ever formally reported, nothing that had ever reached management in a way that stuck, for cultivating close relationships with engaged or married female clients specifically. One woman, a former client at his previous studio, had left an anonymous but pointed review 2 years earlier warning other clients to be careful how personal your trainer gets, a review that had been quietly removed within days, likely at the studio's request. I never contacted Derek directly. I didn't need to, but in the process of Priya's financial trace, it became clear that Derek had been running a similar arrangement, small, undisclosed, personal training package, charges layered on top of his standard invoicing, with at least one other client at his current studio, a woman whose husband, it turned out, had also grown suspicious around the same period, entirely independent of anything happening in my life. I learned this secondhand through Marcus, who'd done enough of this kind of work over the years to recognize a pattern. When he saw one repeat itself across multiple households, Derek's employment at the studio ended 2 months later, following an internal review neither Camille nor I had any direct hand in initiating. Whatever happened next in his life happened without my involvement. I didn't need to be the instrument of consequence for every person who'd played a role in this. I only needed to make sure the truth, in my own life, stopped being something only Camille got to control. I'll admit there was a brief period in the weeks right after the party when I considered reaching out to that other husband, a stranger to me. Someone I only knew existed because of an overlapping thread in Marcus's research. I decided against it. It wasn't my story to insert myself into, and I'd already seen. In my own case, how much damage gets done when someone else's timeline gets forced onto a situation that isn't theirs to manage. If the truth found him the way it found me, it would find him on its own schedule. I didn't need to be the one carrying every match. I moved out of the apartment fully within 3 weeks, into a smaller place on the other side of the city, a one-bedroom with good light and none of the furniture we'd chosen together. I remember the specific relief of assembling a bookshelf alone on a Sunday afternoon. No negotiation over where it should go. No accommodation of someone else's preference for symmetry over function. It sounds small. It wasn't small. It was the first structural decision I'd made entirely on my own terms in years. And something about that steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. I want to be honest about the weeks that followed, because I don't think this story is well served by pretending the resolution felt clean or triumphant. It didn't, not at first. There were nights I sat in that new apartment replaying 6 years of a relationship, trying to identify the exact moment it had started to hollow out. And never quite landing on a single answer, because I don't think there was a single moment. I think some relationships erode the way coastlines erode, not through one storm, but through years of small waves you don't notice until the shape of the land has already changed. Elena came over most Sundays that first month with takeout and a specific brand of patience that let me talk when I needed to and sit in silence when I didn't. You didn't do anything wrong, she told me once, early on, when I was cycling through the familiar, useless exercise of wondering what I could have done differently. You built something honestly. She's the one who decided to build something else on top of it without telling you. I want to say something about the word boring because it followed me for a while after that night, not because I believed it exactly, but because words like that have a way of lodging themselves somewhere and taking longer to dislodge than they took to say. I thought about it during quiet moments over the following months. Whether reliability really is a lesser virtue than whatever excitement Camille had been chasing in a hotel room 12 minutes from her office. I don't think it is. I think some people mistake steadiness for a lack of life, right up until the moment the excitement they chased instead turns out to be built on nothing more solid than a prepaid phone and a lie they were telling themselves as much as they were telling me. There was a specific afternoon, about 2 months after the party, when that word finally started to loosen its grip. I was rebuilding a set of shelves in my new apartment, methodically, one bracket at a time, and Owen had come over to help, mostly by handing me tools and talking through whatever was on his mind. At some point he asked, without much preamble, whether I regretted how I'd handled the party, whether some part of me wished I'd said something privately instead of in front of everyone. I thought about it honestly before answering. No, I said. She spent 2 months deciding, over and over, that I didn't deserve the truth. I don't think I owed her a private, comfortable version of finding that out. Owen didn't argue with that. He just nodded, handed me the next bracket, and said, for what it's worth, you're the least boring person I know. You just don't need everyone to notice it to know it's true. I didn't say much in response, but I remember that comment landing somewhere useful, the way small, unplanned things sometimes do more repair work than anything deliberately said to comfort you. My work, oddly, became one of the steadiest anchors during that period. I picked up 2 new client engagements that spring, both complex enough to require real focus. And I found a specific kind of relief in problems that had clear, discoverable answers, a compromised server, a phishing vector, a misconfigured firewall rule, the kind of puzzle where, if you look carefully enough, the truth is always sitting somewhere in the logs, waiting to be found. It occurred to me, more than once, that I'd spent 2 months applying exactly that instinct to my own life. And that the instinct hadn't failed me there either. It had just taken longer, and cost more, than any client breach ever had. 6 months after the party, my company sent me to a security conference in Austin, 3 days of panels and after hours networking events I almost skipped, the way I'd almost skipped most social things that year. I went anyway, mostly because Elena told me, in her characteristically blunt way, that isolating myself wasn't recovery, it was just a slower version of the same wound. I met a woman there, a compliance officer named Priya Anand. No relation to the forensic accountant, an odd coincidence of shared first names I noticed and mentioned, which made her laugh harder than the joke probably deserved. We talked for almost 2 hours at the closing reception, about nothing especially significant at first, a shared appreciation for old analog cameras, an argument about whether Austin or Denver has better breakfast tacos. The kind of easy conversation that doesn't require either person to perform anything. What struck me most, sitting across from her at a high-top table while the reception thinned out around us, wasn't any single thing she said. It was the specific, unfamiliar sensation of a conversation that didn't require me to manage anything underneath it, no second phone to account for, no calendar entry to quietly cross reference later, no careful listening for the gap between what someone says and what's actually true. I hadn't realized, until that moment, how much low-level vigilance I'd been carrying for the better part of a year. Even after the relationship itself had ended, as if some part of me had simply kept the monitoring software running out of habit. Sitting there, for those 2 hours, it felt, briefly, switched off. At one point, she asked what had brought me to cybersecurity in the first place. And I told her the honest, unremarkable answer, that I liked systems. Liked understanding how things actually worked underneath the surface people present to the world. She smiled and said, "That's a good instinct to have. Most people don't look past the surface until it's already too late." I didn't tell her the rest of it that night. There will be time for that, if there's a reason for there to be time. What I noticed, driving back to my hotel afterward, wasn't excitement exactly, nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Just a quiet, steady sense that the part of me capable of building something slowly, carefully, on solid ground, hadn't gone anywhere. It had just been waiting for a foundation worth building on again. I saw Camille once more, about 8 months after the party, entirely by accident. At a grocery store neither of us used to frequent. She'd apparently moved to a new apartment on that side of town. We stood in the cereal aisle for a moment, the two of us, neither quite sure what the etiquette was for a moment like that. She looked thinner, tired in a way that seemed to run deeper than a bad night's sleep. She asked how I was doing. I told her, honestly, that I was doing well. She said she was glad. There was an awkward pause, the kind that used to be filled easily by 6 years of shared history and was now just empty. Space between two people who no longer knew how to fill it.